because that lady with the alien probe.
Oh, I've seen this before.
I just thought I'd die.
I thought you'd enjoy it. Yeah. Are you a big Penn and Teller fan, or is this your first time? Did we break you in with this?
But I've been to one of those UFO conferences, and they're just about that nutty.
Yeah, that was the real deal, right? That's how it really is.
Yes, it is. But I don't think I ever saw anybody with anal beads. I've seen those before. Oh my God. I thought I'd calm down from that. I watched it about half an hour ago. I had to put it on pause.
That's pretty hilarious.
Oh, God. Anyway, I'm sorry.
We'll be talking about, for those wondering what Dr. Farrell's laughing about, we'll be talking about it in the show a little bit. We won't go into details because there's some things we can't repeat on a family show. But suffice it to say, we'll provide the link in the notes. And you might need to pause for laughter as you watch it as well.
But don't watch it in front of your children.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe not a good idea.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I like the hat, Dr. Farrell. Reminds me of Laurel and Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy.
It's a Homburg, actually. I've had it for a couple of years. I've just not worn them on these shows.
Well, I think I saw Frosty the Snowman wearing one in the original cartoon. You know, it's kind of like that, right?
Homburg, yeah.
Yeah, and also, you know,
one of my favorite organ composers, Vidor, wore Homburgs. So this is my little homage to.
Well, I just want to hear you do an impression, because it feels like if you could just say, "We will fight them from the stairwells and from the roofs and from the basements and from the bridges. We will fight them." If you could just, we will fight them from the kitchen.
Madam, you are ugly. And tomorrow I shall be sober. Oh my.
Well, Dr. Farrell, we have an interesting show today.
I'm sure we do.
Indeed.
I'm sorry. I'll get over it.
Behind closed doors. And all over the world, scientists are working on projects designed to take man beyond the confines of this earth. You are looking at the actual models of spacecraft now being developed by agencies of the United States.
Well, yeah, if that gives anyone a clue of what we are about to talk about today, then that means you have watched a movie called Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women, and we've outed you on this show. If that's familiar, if you're like, I've heard that before, we got you. And there's a moment we'll talk about. I think I've seen this before in the show, and apply it to something different. And that's what Dr. Farrell was laughing about at the beginning. So we did the G-rated one, Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women.
Oh dear.
Penn and Teller took it to where the prehistoric women actually do their shopping, and that was a little bit different. I mean, Dr. Farrell, they weren't just beads; there was a lot of beads. I mean, when you say probe, it was.
But the bad thing is, I've seen this before.
She seemed delighted. She's
really...
like, I remember the feelings that I felt. So, we'll get into it. So, Dr. Farrell, we're here today to talk about aliens, and I have a few subtopics and segments of the show. So I'll give people a preview. Segment 1 of the show is about the business of aliens, and segment 2 is about the psychology of aliens, and segment 3 is about theories of aliens. And I have lined up 7 main theories and about 8 or 9 little theories that are interesting, and want to sort of run them by you.
Okay.
So this is the alien episode. We've touched on it. We've teased it, but this is the time when we take it apart by the beads. So
Bead by bead.
bead by bead, we're gonna pull each bead off the string and see what it's made of, and
Okay.
where it's been, what it's coated with.
Don't go there, Daniel.
But so the first thing, Dr. Farrell, is that the business of aliens. So before the show, I sent you a clue of what the show was about in the form of a Penn and Teller episode. Now, Penn and Teller have multiple shows, and specifically, this show is called Bullshit! Exclamation point. So it's Penn and Teller Bullshit. And it was episode 3, which is about alien abduction.
Right.
So I sent you that one and another episode to kind of give you some backdrop of where they're coming from and what kinds of things they expose. I particularly found their show about mediums who contact the dead very interesting. But it's about cold reading, and they really broke down how cold reading works and so on. So, but I couldn't help notice something. I mean, their show's only half an hour. It's a short, quick hit. And well, except in the case of that lady, that was not a short, quick hit. That was, but the show is very brief, and so it leaves lots of open-ended things for you to ask about and think about and explore. And the first thing I want to ask you about in the business of aliens is these alien UFO conferences, these things that they have all over the country. I guess there's a lot of them in Vegas and California. There seems to be a lot of West Coast conference holding. I'm sure they're everywhere, but I couldn't help but notice that it seems to be a lot of people selling things to each other. Yes. So like almost like a market, the way Wall Street is a market. So there's some people are selling event space, and some people are buying event space, and then what they're selling is books, tapes, and video. And some people are buying the books, tapes, and video, but what they're selling is regression hypnosis therapy. And it seems to be this ecosystem of commerce that's going on. And I wonder if you think, because that's when I saw how big some of these conferences are, and the diversity of the people that attend in terms of, sort of age group, although it's not that diverse, but sort of age group and demographic and stuff. I thought, are there really that many people that are sort of believe in this? And what I kind of took away is, well, what if it's primarily a commercial event and a commercial phenomenon? What if a good chunk of UFO culture is really what I saw with psychic mediums in their earlier episode, which is that you get sort of a group of people who everybody believes they're fooling each other, and they're not the one being fooled. But in fact, everybody's buying and selling within that system. So all people are therefore being fooled. In the episode that we're talking about, Dr. Farrell, and again, we'll include the link, there's a guy that's kind of mysteriously going around the show, and he's writing notes in a notepad. And they kept pointing this guy out in his cohort, and they interviewed them both. And they said they think that we're fooled, but these guys are faking. They're performance artists. They aren't real. They're not believers. They're fakers, and they think we're the gullible parts. But actually, because we're the watchers of the show, we know that those guys, the fakers, are the gullible people. I'm asking you if this is kind of a continuous loop of people sure that they're fooling other people, but in fact themselves being fooled.
Well, I'm glad you decided to do it on the UFO conference culture. I after watching the Penn and Teller, I didn't know.
I thought you'd love it.
I did. Because their reaction to it is pretty much my own. I've been to 2 of those conferences. I've been to the Ozark UFO conference once in Eureka Springs. I went to the Laughlin UFO Congress, which was the big one for quite a number of years. I went to that once. It's an all-week event, or at least it was back then. That one in San Francisco that Penn and Teller went to, that's another big one. They have another one in Joshua Tree, California. So you're right, those conferences do hover around the West Coast. to a large extent, and my impression was exactly theirs. You have a certain core of, for want of a better expression, real believers, and I do think that aspects of ufology culture are dangerously religious or cult-like. Because there is an almost complete suspension of critical reasoning, argumentation. And the other thing that buttresses my opinion in that respect about those conferences is that they tend to invite the same people to speak over and over again, and they end up talking about the same thing, which is experiences. Um, the alien abduction stuff, basically people getting up and talking about what they've experienced in terms of their abduction thing or their particular sighting event or what have you. I did not like either UFO conference that I went to because my approach to those things is very, very different. And in fact, when we were doing the secret space program conferences, we did make an effort to avoid inviting the same old speakers to talk about the same old stuff. We wanted people to give an argued presentation about things rather than talk about experiences. We actually had people trying to crash our conferences that came out of those conference cultures. And it's got to the point recently where I think what you're seeing is full-scale marketing operations. The Corey Goode, David Wilcock, Blue Chickens phenomenon. On a more sophisticated version, Tom DeLonge and his To the Stars Academy, which he tried to get me to be involved with. I think that those things do tend to be businesses of people selling to each other, because in every conference I've been to, most of the activity hovers around the booths where people are selling all sorts of stuff, their books, in many cases, or just trinkets and so on and so forth. It's almost like it's their yearly synod. I don't know how else to call it, where they get together and share their UFO experiences. That's why I think it's dangerously cult-like. I hope that answers your question, because I found myself more or less in agreement with Penn and Teller. Anybody, I've said over and over again, folks, anybody can get in front of a camera and tell a story or claim to be a whistleblower. It's when you get down to arguing a case, well, this UFO is genuinely extraterrestrial because we looked at the physics and there's no way we could do it, and we're offering this argument why. That's a different approach to ufology than what is normally the case.
Well, I couldn't help but notice that there's a lot of priority, as you kind of pointed out, given to anecdotal evidence.
Yes.
And personal experiences.
Yes.
And a lot of evidence that isn't evidence. I think in a slightly longer version of that episode, or maybe I don't recall, maybe it was covered early on in the episode, they're pointing out that some of the sort of traits that you get are, like, number one, missing time, and number two, unexplained scars, and number three, sort of sleep paralysis. And, they pointed out that missing time is normal. It happens to everybody, frequently, that it doesn't make me special. It doesn't make me different than other people. And I need to go find some explanation for this that is outside the norm, because it's normal for most people. Number two is the scars things. I know people who do this all the time. They're like, where did I hurt myself? Why is there a big mark all the way up my side? And it's like, well, don't you remember 2 days ago you bumped into the cabinet? Well, I don't think this would leave that mark. And I'm like, well, apparently it did, or I'll have a mark and I can't explain it. Lo and behold, I slept on my keys or something, and we all find scars because most of us do not inspect every
Right.
centimeter of our body on a daily basis. In fact, if we did, it would make us a little unusual. And so maybe that's the part that's unusual. But so we all get dents and dings on a giant thing like our body that we don't inspect constantly. I'm sure there are some marks on your car. You don't know where they came from. And then finally, sleep paralysis is something that happens to everybody about an hour before they wake up. That, not all people all the time, not every night, but very often it's a normal stage of sleep where your mind's awake, but your body's not connected to your mind yet. And so technically you can't move. It doesn't feel like you can't move because you could wake yourself up further, and now they're connected. But until that next stage of waking occurs, just like there's stages of sleep, there's stages of waking, you can't actually move. And so moving is an indication you've reached that next stage. So they're taking a constellation of very ordinary physiological phenomenon and describing them, compiling them as evidence of alien abduction, when in fact, it seems like that what's required to turn that into a narrative of alien abduction is sort of a basic ignorance of human physiology, a basic a lack of awareness of sort of how things work, and what other people experience, and a need to somehow be special and to explain things through an alternative narrative. And so I just bring it right back down to that's the most appropriate use of Occam's razor, is not that there isn't an alternative narrative because an alternative narrative is more complex, but that one need not resort to an alternative narrative if a simpler narrative would explain it. Like, oh, I bumped into a cabinet and didn't notice, and it left a bigger mark than I thought, or I slept on my keys.
Well, this is my fundamental problem with ufology culture. I do view it as quasi-religious in nature. And in fact, there's a good book, if people are not aware of it. I went and pulled this off my shelf prior to this dialogue. It's called The Gods Have Landed, and subtitle is New Religions from Other Worlds, edited by James R. Lewis. This is published by the State University of New York. So it's kind of an academic study of the religious elements in that sort of experience-oriented UFO culture. And what has always bothered me about what I've seen happen in ufology is that the serious researchers tend to get overlooked or pushed aside. The floor in these conferences overwhelmingly, if you look at the list of speakers in them, the floor overwhelmingly is devoted to relations of supposed contact experiences, abduction experiences. And you can go back, and I did this with saucers, swastikas, and psyops. You can go back and look at the early contactee literature, George Van Tassel, George Adamski, people like that were claiming, and the modern version of it with Corey Goode, claiming that he's been contacted and made the representative messenger for all of this ET stuff. What bothers me about it is, in many cases, you can almost draw exact parallels between religion, traditional religion, and the UFO contactee or abduction experience. In Adamski's case, as I pointed out in Saucers, Swastikas, and Psyops, you had a guy that was claiming that he was being told messages from Venusians that were in contact with him. And if you look at it, this experience takes place, number one, in a desert and over a hill. In other words, Moses going up to the mountain and meeting with God, and he's being given messages and so on and so forth. So there's aspects of this that look to me very much like religion, and the abduction experience in that, to me, looks like kind of the ufological equivalent to a testimony within evangelicalism. In other words, as you pointed out, it's your testimony that you're special, that you've been singled out for participation in whatever program the alleged ETs are running. In some cases, they're given messages to relay to humanity, and the messages themselves are of a bland, kind of general, feel-good, new agey, Gnostic sort of sentimentality. So there's too much of it, Daniel, that strikes me not only as a business. These people are like that lady in the Penn and Teller video said, are making tens of thousands of dollars off of these conferences. But at the same time, they're promoting a culture where you're switching off your reasoning faculty. And, this is one of the big things that the organizers of the Secret Space Program conference that I spoke at those 2 times that they held them, was that they were trying to get away from that culture and have only speakers that were not talking from their alleged experiences, but were trying to argue certain hypotheses on the basis of research and argumentation. And there's far too little of that in the ufology community. I think a lot of it's just plain cult-like. That's my bottom line.
Well, certainly it reminds me of another cult, and I'm going to use that word in lowercase and in quote marks, because there are people that seem to want to hunt you down if you call their thing a cult, Scientologists, and make a really big deal out of it. Whereas, like, you call the Jehovah's Witnesses a cult, and they don't do anything really, except maybe mail you a magazine. Scientologists are really defensive, right? Yeah. But I think of Scientology because it's reinforced by a quasi-medical culture, and it's a culture of denial. It's a culture of denial of organized medicine or corporate medicine, etc. And don't get me wrong, I've had to cure my own things and fix myself multiple times because multiple doctors treated me and they kept focusing on one little compartmentalized thing, or they kept handing me painkillers and other things, and not really dealing with what is causing the problem, but just let's make you feel better. And maybe you'll go to another doctor when I quit giving you painkillers. It's like they almost want to create an addict out of me. Here's painkillers. That's what you came for, right? And I'm like, no, not actually. I hate all of that stuff too. Don't get me wrong. And but that doesn't mean I go to a shaman to solve my issue. Right. And here it seems like that this amateur therapy that's involved in the alien abduction community is pretty potent in convincing people that there is a credibility, or it makes their own sort of questionable experience. Is that a delusion of mine? Am I fantasizing? Am I daydreaming? Did I dream that? It gives it the weight of somehow feeling more credible. And these amateur therapists, their strongest claim to fame, you saw the lady in the video. She goes, I'm a licensed regression hypnotherapist. And it's like, so her strongest thing is she got a license, which isn't that hard in California. They give you a license to do just about anything. I'm a licensed snot healer. It's like I walk around with a handkerchief and they'll do it. Vegas too. It isn't hard. So, but they go to these groups. My favorite was the one that said that she had an alien wedding and the marriage ceremony was really cute, but she was disturbed by the honeymoon. I found that a little odd. Sounds like an interfaith marriage or something, but they go, and the question that Penn and Teller raised is, are they the guest, they had a guest that was talking about this. And the question that he raised was, are they recovering memories or are they implanting memories? And one could argue there's something in between, which is you can recover a memory that was there. You can implant a memory when there's absolutely nothing there. But what if there's something in between? There's fantasy, there's ideation, there's daydreaming, there's dreaming. And what you do is you sort of convert that seed, that kernel of something, into what you now treat as a memory. And I couldn't help but notice, Dr. Farrell, that every single person in that amateur therapy session said that they're on medication for anxiety and a variety of things. And every single person, another trait in those therapy sessions, had were sort of involved for the long term, 4 years, 12 years, 5 years. That for them, it was kind of a culture of long-term support groups.
Yep.
It's very much like what the doctor would do if a lot of these doctors, if they didn't cure my problem, they just put me in a long-term culture of painkillers that are supposed to be used on a temporary basis. But since they're not going to explain my issue, I now become a permanent user of these drugs. They're creating in these regression hypnotherapy sessions where they then sell you the support group after that, a long-term user or addict, it seems like,
bingo.
of support groups.
Bingo. I was about to say that much of this culture strikes me as very addictive. And there are a number of studies, not just this book that I mentioned. Dr. Jacques Vallée has approached this whole abduction, contactee, experiencer, whatever you wish to call it, part of ufology from the angle of comparing the experiences with medieval lore about the succubus and the incubus, because a lot of these abduction stories have a very, very strong undertow of sexuality, of actual sex in some cases. So it becomes an addictive culture in that sense. And this is the other thing that I'm glad you used that word addiction, because it struck me when the few times I've spoken at these kinds of conferences, and I have to be honest, I did not enjoy them for precisely the reason that I'm around people like that. They're the vast majority of people at those conferences. They want to hear something sensational. And it's an addiction to them. It's a reinforcement and addiction pattern that, their basic belief structure is being reinforced at these things. I think there's a strong undertow of that. Carl Gustav Jung did a study from his psychological point of view of the UFO culture, the contactee culture, and he thinks it's something deeply rooted in the human psyche, that there's something compelling us to want to have these kinds of experiences, Moses on the mountain, or George Van Tassel with his Venusians out in the desert. All of this stuff, it's very, very foreign to me. It's not the way I like to approach the subject of ufology at all. And we're seeing another effort right now, Daniel, with major marketing operations, I think, that are being run very clearly to reinforce this whole ET abduction contact mentality in ufology right now. So it simply does not want to go away. And it seems to be reinforced every time that it begins to come under threat from real research. I'll just be very blunt about it. When real research starts getting involved, then there seems to be a correspondent push to get the ufology community back into talking about their stories about abductions and so on and so forth. It's very disconcerting to me.
Well, Dr. Farrell, and with respect to your hat there, I want to, I finally figured out who you remind me of. It's just Boy George with his Hamburg.
That's not a Hamburg, please.
But
this is a Hamburg.
All right, well, I'll take another stab. We'll have another lower third soon. But,
thanks.
But I can't help but think, you talked about Jung's study and the belief that there's something sort of in the human psyche that drives this. And I can't help but wonder if it's something in the American psyche in particular. It's not that these things aren't in Europe, etc. But I'll give you an example. There's two things. I can't, and then I'll focus on the alien side. It's been studied before. There is a tendency in the U.S., or at least was up until the recent 3 or 4 years, to romanticize what it is to be foreign. So you get the one guy that shows up at your public school, in your high school, that's from France, or the other guy that's from Puerto Rico, and that guy's the center of attention, and everybody wants to know, oh, he's so cool, tell me all about it, etc. And you find this reflected in a kind of a syndrome where people travel and they come back speaking kind of a fake Italian accent, or they go overseas, as you did and spend a year in Great Britain, and they come back and suddenly they're all British all the time. And we find that this is caused by a sense of homelessness, that we don't feel that we have a uniquely American culture that we can belong to in the same way that an Italian can be Italian or a French person can be French. And that feeling of alienation or disconnection leads a lot of people to sort of take that step of trying to associate with a particular ancestry. And some people just obsess about their family tree for this reason. In a similar way, another version of that, if some people are like, no, screw the foreigners, I'm American, right? But then we quickly break up into cliques, very much again like what happens in high school. The need to identify is so strong that you get gun guys, and they're all about guns. Everything is guns all the time: gun racks, gun accessories, gun membership. You get your sports guys; they can't stop talking about it. It's 24/7. You get your car guys, and pretty soon you're one of something. You're identified with a group of people, and that need to identify seems incredibly strong for a country that lauds the maverick, the John Wayne that tames the West, or the Clint Eastwood that goes it alone, or and so on, or the James Dean. So I say that as a preface to say that I can't help but look at guys like in the UFO conference, and this guy. You don't have to watch the video. We've all talked to this guy or heard this guy talk. When it comes down to any kind of a Men in Black or conspiracy theory, there's always some guy that says, you ask him a question, like he'll say something, he'll claim to know something, you'll say, how do you know that? And he'll say, I can't tell you that on camera, because if I told you, they would come and get me and I would be immediately arrested and imprisoned for my knowledge that I have. So I can't reveal how I have this knowledge. And so they got that guy is just one of the types of people you meet at the UFO convention. And you can't help but sense, just rolling off of this person, exaggerated feelings of self-importance, a feeling that person is central to the narrative about UFOs in the world, a narcissism almost combined with a low self-esteem.
Bingo.
A loneliness and a need to be important and connect to people and be part of something, but also not to get lost within it and just be one of the many who are attending the convention, et cetera. A sense of being deeply alienated and a need to recover from that. You sense that same thing. You sense sort of obsessive gun nuts and car nuts doing, and the same thing you sense people with the fake accents doing, just rolling off of them. And it's by no accident that some of that analysis has played on Jung's psychological interest in this, to find that people are more likely to feel low self-esteem and high narcissism in this sort of alternative UFO culture.
Absolutely. And you raise an important point about, is this something that is being fueled by the American culture or lack thereof? I'm one of those that personally doesn't think America does have a culture in any identifiable sense. It has an idea of a culture, but that's something very different, because we see that being used in politics all the time, on the right, on the left, in the center, of some sort of ideal that we're always striving for, but we never achieve. And it becomes very easy to manipulate people through that. I think part of it is coming out of European and American secularism. And again, the key for me that you're looking at a kind of secular religion here is that you can draw almost an exact parallel with some of these abduction experiences and the people that are, as you say, and I think rightly, very narcissistic. They're part of the central message and narrative, that these experiences are ways to validate their self-importance. Well, you find a similar thing in certain types of American evangelicalism, where people are getting, messages from God through the Holy Spirit and so on and so forth. And it reinforces their sense of self-importance, and it gives them something to identify with. I think you're kind of looking at the secular version of that in a lot of these ufology conferences. They have about them the feel, to me, and this was particularly the case when I went to the Laughlin conference. I had to leave early. I just couldn't stand it after a couple days, because it felt like a week-long revival meeting. And you know me, I'm just not sympathetic to the evangelical, sort of expression of things. That's the way it felt to me. So yeah, it's an addiction. It's a reinforcement of alienated people to give them a sense of self-importance. Um, and there's also this kind of, I don't know how else to put it. I sensed an undertow in that Penn and Teller video also of a bit of paranoia, because everybody kept saying, well, they're here, and they've been here a long time, and we're in contact with them, and some of these people here may be them. Well, that's fine. I've said similar things myself on occasion, but my point in saying that is, okay, if you're going to say that, then how do you find out who they are? The only way to do that would be genetic testing, compiling massive DNA databases. But in these UFO conferences, they don't go to that step. In other words, they're putting these things out there not for some sort of speculation or argument or discussion. They're putting these things out there as a belief system. And again, that to me is coming out of this secular culture that we've seen arise in Europe. You've got the same thing going on in Europe, abductions over there and UFO cults and so on, the UMO cult in Spain and all of that. So yeah, I'm thinking this is to a certain extent coming out of the demise of religion in the West. In American culture, I think it's coming out of the leveling that goes on in American culture, and the constant division within it. I think there's a lot of causes for it. And incidentally, since you raised the subject of alienation, Daniel, I want to point out that book again that I showed people at the beginning of this dialogue gets into precisely that question in a couple of the essays and papers in that book, which is very interesting that they pinned this down too. Oh boy.
Well, Dr. Farrell, I'm surprised you say there's no American culture, because when I think of American culture, I think you just have to take a bus there, Dr. Farrell. You can even skip your hotel and leave your bags with the concierge and just pick them up with your outside the mall. This is American culture.
Yeah, I know. I know.
By the way, ladies and gentlemen, I think we should ask the audience to vote for who has the best hat by the end of the show. So please send in your tallies through the comment section below the video. Just log in and tell us what you like about each other's hats. I will point out that my initial is on my hat. Mine prioritizes the person over nature, the particular over the form. Where it's Dr. Farrell's.
This is a classy hat. This is a real Humber.
What are you trying to say? This is American. This is American.
Like I said, this is my homage to Jean-Marie Vidor.
See, and do we know who the heck that is? He sounds foreign to me.
Yeah, he's a foreigner, and he's not a UFO abductee.
He's a fur bearer.
Thank you very much.
I don't even know. He's a furry. That just sounds...
No,
well,
come on. You know who Vidor is. Good grief.
Well, Dr. I think he was in Ghostbusters. Vigor, the magnificent. Vigor, he wants the virgin and a small child.
Yeah. He was playing the organ in Ghostbusters. Yeah,
that's right. Well, I did like that point that some of the aliens, they're walking around the conference saying some of these people may be them, and I'm like, if the aliens were here, that's where we'd find them. Maybe they're all at the conference.
Conferences, yeah.
Thinking go to the UFO conference. That's why the parking lot's full of discs.
Well, yeah. If they're at the conferences, they're thinking we've got a lot of work to do with these monkeys.
Yeah, or they just want to sell them a couple of books, tapes, and a Frankfurter. It's like, that's what we do with aliens. The first ones that arrive, we're really suspicious at ones that won't buy our food truck stuff.
That's true. That they are big business. They really are.
Yeah. If you're not going to be capitalist, you don't fit into our planetary system.
No.
We're coming to mine your asteroids. Well, I think you made an important point, Dr. Farrell, which is that secularism requires a surrogate because the nature of man is religious. And this is something that, just like in the search for artificial intelligence, we try to use a peculiarly materialistic definition of man that says that man, first, the mind is local, is entirely local. We're not saying it's not rooted in locality, but that it 100% exists in a local place. And secondly, it's just a series of algorithms and chemicals rather than potentially anything more. And one could argue that the only way you'll ever achieve artificial intelligence is if you reject that thesis, which makes for some interesting ways to get there. But in this case, what we see is a denial in many ways that man is inherently religious. We have a sort of a post-secular culture in which, because we've said that religion isn't really an important part of things. Nietzsche wouldn't have said that. He would have said if we weren't religious, we would need to create a religion. Right. But so he almost, from an anthropological standpoint,
came to the same conclusion.
But what we resort to is we resort to cliques. Well, I'm a gun guy, I'm a sports guy, I'm a car guy. We resort to and all those are male just because I'm male, but there are female versions of them. Or we resort to the need to identify with a group, even to a certain degree. I am a member of the left or the right or whatever it is, or, I'm a libertarian. There's almost some of that may be propelled by our intellect, but some of it may be propelled by our need to identify with something and to replace what religion used to give us. And then even this need to identify with something beyond our world, to kind of push it to a level, whether it's about cars or our political affiliation or UFOs, to push it to a level of almost transcendent importance. To the degree that, there were guys that killed each other over an argument about Chevrolet versus Ford. There are people killing each other over differences of how they voted and who should have won. And somebody should tell them hypotheticals don't exist, right? And then there's so far, I have yet to hear a reported death over a ufology argument, but give it time, because we're placing a lot of emphasis on alternatives to religion. So I want to point out, before I throw it back to you, that Psychology Today in 2012 did an article that says called 5 Traits That Could Get You Abducted by Aliens. And it was kind of tongue in cheek, because they were saying, if you have any of these 5 traits, the chances are you're going to believe that you're going to believe that you've been abducted by aliens. Number one is the first 2 are basic. If you tend to have more sleep paralysis and hallucinations when you're waking, which a lot of Americans do, you're twice as likely to believe you've been abducted by aliens. If you tend to have false memory syndrome, the tendency to recall things that didn't happen, then you're about twice as likely as most Americans to believe you've been abducted. But then it goes on. If you tend to fall into absorption, and absorption is a thing where you begin to sort of fantasize, or you ideate, and you find it hard to distinguish between the thing you're imagining and something real. And a lot of people will say, well, that never happens to me. I find it happens to the average person. If one can just think of a time when you were mad at somebody, and you're mad at somebody because they did something, and they've done it a couple of times, and you sit and you think, well, I could say this to them, but then they would just do this. And if I said this, they would do this. And here's what he'd probably say. And you get all worked up, and none of that ever happened. But then very often we go on and live as though that person actually did have that conversation with us, and he did say all those things, and we're mad. We're so mad we just want to fight. And that could be our wife or our best friend or somebody we really just don't like. And in a way, that sort of ideation we become so absorbed in it that it acts like a memory. So that's one of the traits, is absorption. Another is alternative beliefs. We're much more likely to believe we've been abducted if we believe in New Age, healing, astrology, fortune telling, alternative medicine. That those things already sort of reject traditional narratives and traditional epistemological means of deciding what's true.
Right.
And so it opens us up. Well, if everything's up for grab, and the traditional rules that we've developed over 4,000 years to decide how we know whether a thing is real or not, or so or not. If we just throw all of that out, all the Platonic logic and Socratic dialogue and everything, and we just go, anything's up for grabs, then we're literally inventing, in the space of a few minutes, relatively speaking, in time, another way of deciding what's true. And that's really risky. And the 5th one is our tendency to immerse ourselves in or become familiar with the existing cultural narrative of abduction. If we tend to be listening to that and reading it and be familiar with it, we tend to be more likely to believe that it's happened to us. And so what I wanted to point out, Dr. Farrell, is you've got these people sort of looking for a surrogate for religion, and they show up at a UFO conference, and it's easy for us to look and go, gosh, that person is just lying when they say they've been abducted, or that person is just stupid. You know, they can't tell reality from fiction. But what seems to happen is a conspiracy of different factors, some internal and some external in the culture, all working to convince us that we are part of this narrative. And we actually have to have some sort of resistance to avert that happening to us. Everybody listening to the show right now, if they didn't have some sort of built-in resistance, well, I'm committed to logic and I'm going to work through this,
Right.
or, you know, I have a different narrative. If we weren't committed to that something, there, but for the grace of God, we could become the kookiest person we ever saw at a UFO conference.
One of the things that is very noticeable to me, you mentioned the word epistemology. One of the things that's very noticeable to me about these conferences is that there are two epistemological cultures. And one of the things that fascinates me about this is that if you go to these conferences, again, I've only been to two. I've been around people that have been to other conferences, but by and large, my experience at Laughlin and then at the Ozark conference, which was quite a bit different than the Laughlin conference, was that I was amazed at how many people would admit, on the one hand, that when it comes to any sort of traditional religious belief, even a belief in atheism, how many of those people were at the same time willing to hear stories about abductions and kind of switch off what otherwise was a normal epistemological skepticism for them. You know, I come at this whole thing from the standpoint that if you're gonna argue for the existence of ET or that we have been contacted, that you're going to have to go back and you're going to have to examine the evidence. You're going to have to parse it very carefully. You're going to have to examine the evidence for a technology that can get them from there to here, and so on and so forth, which I think is, you know, if you're going to do this sort of stuff, that's about the only sound way to do it. So you're dealing with two different epistemological cultures, one that is very narcissistic and very alienated and very addicted and wanting something of transcendence, and you know they're willing to do almost anything to get it, including having fake memories implanted by therapists. And it's, you know, let me point out that therapist, when you listen to her in the Penn and Teller video, she is doing something that no good hypnotist would do, and that is she's not asking questions in the right way. She's confabulating a memory and injecting it into, as that one individual points out, she's asking questions in such a way to construct a memory rather than pull out a memory. So yeah, I think there's two epistemological cultures at work. And the problem here, Daniel, as far as I can see it, is that the UFO conference culture is a symptom of something much wider in the culture at large. So in other words, I think that you have to look at the UFO conference culture as being an expression of something at work in society itself, where you're not dealing with people anymore that can ground an argument epistemologically. They have no concept anymore of how to do that. That's why these things thrive. That's why we have the astrology conferences and the New Age crystal conferences and the UFO conferences, and on it goes. To me, it's all symptomatic of a breakdown in the wider culture.
Well, I I just want to remind people that they need to vote. And
Oh.
if you're going to vote, remember one of these hats is American and the other hat was in The Godfather. And so I just, if you believe in the criminal element, the gangsters and their hats, vote for Dr. Farrell's hat. If you believe in an all-American, baseball look, you should vote for this thing right here.
Daniel.
Yes.
Set it to music.
Yes, we can do that. We can set it to music.
Please.
All right. So with we'll come up with some music, Speak softly, love, and hold me close.
Don't go there.
A little gangster music. That's from The Godfather.
Yes, I know. And this is not a fedora. This is a Hamburg.
Well, it all seems suspicious to me. Communism, Bolshevism, same thing.
And I am wearing a vest too. And that
it makes me even more suspicious, Dr. Farrell. I think Stalin wore vests. I mean,
right. Yeah.
Actually, that looks like a vest. To be fair, it looks like a vest from Walgreens or Blockbuster because it's blue, and
it's blue velvet. And I'm wearing a double Albert watch fob with it too as well.
You see what I mean, folks?
There we are. Yes, I'm the Godfather. Yes, I've sold out to all of that European stuff.
Yes, we call it Eurotrash, and it's and sometimes it's flashy, not quite, like Russian gangster flashy, but it's flashy. And
well, look who's talking here. But go
all right, so but we will set it to music. This inspire. We haven't done an outtakes clip in a long time. It's probably the one that we have on the website's quite old.
Yes, I know.
Probably time to comb through the episodes for a few others. Well, moving on to the second segment of our show. This is about 8 theories, 7 actual individual theories, and then what I'll label theory 8, which is a category called other theories. And this has to do with aliens themselves versus, say, alien abduction and UFO conferences. So we covered ufology, UFO conferences. We've covered alien abduction and related things like hypnotherapy. But now on to the aliens themselves. So let's do a theory number 1. Theory number 1, and I am going to reference the UFO conference because it was too good an illustration. The reptile guy. That guy has been around, right? This theory's been around for a long time. Yep. So the reptile guy, what I found interesting about his theory, I hadn't quite picked up on this before, but I expected him to say the reptiles are among us. I saw that movie. It had Charlie Sheen in it, but the reptiles are among us. And, if you look at them right, you can kind of see them in the light that they look reptilian, etc. But what he was saying was a slightly different nature than that. He was saying that the aliens, the reptiles are among us, but they've always been among us, that there's certain bloodlines that are sort of built in. So he's subscribing to a theory, what I'll call theory number 1. Theory number 1 is the always here theory. They've always been here. And in that sense, then they're not aliens. They're just as native to the planet as we are. In fact, one could argue maybe we're the latecomers. But so the theory is they've always been here. And I wanted to ask about this, and the reason I find it interesting is, I'm open to this stuff. I'm not just throwing pot shots at it and making fun. It's got to be a little less wacky than some of what I saw in the Penn and Teller video. But I mean, seriously, to be considered. But I'm open to the science, and I'm open to considering what's going on. I'm familiar with the Fermi paradox, which we've talked about on the show. So here's an observation that I want to give these guys, the people that are in the always here camp. Something I saw that, or a phenomenon that I see that makes me think, and that is when you watch all of these videos that come out about the Air Force seeing these alternative ships in the air that they can't explain, they try to get close, and the ship takes off. And they're always showing these ships and describing them as they're highly maneuverable. They're able to move rapidly and with sudden changes of direction that are just not possible with the technology that we have. And most people look at that and they say, what advanced technology these ships have. this is advanced physics. We can't explain it. Well, I can explain it. I can explain it quite easily if we just drop the alien technology phenomenon. If we just say, well, it's whatever it is, it's something that's not technically alien because it's always been here. It strikes me that the movements of those ships that sort of scoot around, and then the moment they feel like they've been seen, they just take off, make a beeline out of here. I can tell you something else that acts like that: a bug or a mouse. Those things seem very animal-like. Yes. They sort of move around the way a mouse would, or a rodent searching for food or checking out different things. And then the moment you turn the light on or you come after them with a broom, they scurry in a straight line toward the nearest safe place, the nearest exit. In giving one to the they've always been here camp. I don't know about reptiles because I saw the Charlie Sheen movie and I'm like, okay, that's too easy. But it strikes me, what about this possibility that what we're seeing, in fact, are animals that are native to our planet, or at least our planet system? We're not actually seeing mechanical devices at all. Mm-hmm. And I can't help but recall a biblical passage that says something to the effect of, have you seen Behemoth and do you know where Leviathan sleeps? Implying that there are creatures beyond our understanding and ability to fathom that are here, and they're big and different.
Well, I don't rule that out of the picture because within ufology, there is a phenomenon that appeared a few years ago. You don't hear much about it anymore, called rods, RODS, rods. And this was being tracked by a Mexican ufologist, Jose something or other, I forget what his last name was, that took a number of pictures of these things and had people taking pictures of these things. And they look literally like rods with little wings on them. I don't know how else to describe it. They were incredibly fast, very, very difficult to, snap a picture of, but they're apparently out there. So I don't rule out other life forms. I think there are some UFO cases that could indicate that. The behavior is unusual, and like you point out, some of the oddest behavior of them all is, when you see them, they dart away. It's as if they're somehow picking up, our perceptions of them and trying to get out of the picture. I don't rule out technology for a lot of this stuff, and I don't rule out that it could be from people that have been here for quite some time. My approach, as you know, has been looking at ancient texts and just letting them speak for themselves rather than, dismissing them as ancient science fiction and what have you. In those cases, it's very clear that they are maintaining that something from off this planet came here at some point. Even the biblical text, Genesis, came here eons ago, mixed it up with humanity, and stuck around afterwards. So I don't rule that out of the picture either. What I have the problem with is when you get into ideas of reptilians and so on. David Icke is an interesting character because if you go back and look at the way that the story has evolved from him, it seems almost that you're dealing with a tradition of shapeshifters. And again, that's what I find so peculiar about ufology, is that it is really kind of a secular revival of some very ancient tales and lore. And in this case, you're dealing with reptilians who can apparently shapeshift. I've never gone there because, frankly, the texts that I've looked at, Babylonian texts, Egyptian texts, and so on and so forth, what they seem to indicate is that, whoever's doing this, if it's a genuine phenomenon, whoever's doing this looks like us, walks like us, for all intents and purposes, they're hominid type creatures rather than reptiles and what have you. So, I don't get into the taxonomy. I'm willing to say, as a speculation, yeah, they always been here. People may have a point because that's what seems to gel the best with the texts. But that, gelling with the text is not a scientific argument. I think you have to add in the physics component and the genetics component if you're going to make a case for this.
Well, gelling like a felon, Dr. Farrell, I have to say that I think there are aliens among us, but I'm biased. It's because some of them look like that. And you got to admit, when he was jumping up and down on Whoopi Goldberg's sofa or Oprah's sofa, you had to spot right there that something was off with this dude. But if somebody was gonna,
I don't think it's alien.
Well, something's a little weird. I can't put my finger on it, Scientology, but maybe it's because he's from another planet.
Well, Scientology has that myth very strongly present. L. Ron Hubbard wrote a number of books about it, so it's definitely there in Scientology. So who knows?
That's right. L. Ron Hubbard invented a religion. He was an interesting science fiction author.
Yes, he was. He was.
Well, that brings us to theory number 2.
Okay.
Theory number 2 is we got their attention, now what? And so this has to do with the question of what if SETI worked and worked immediately? What if SETI worked the moment we sort of sent it out there, or something like it, some proto-SETI attempt to beam a signal into space? The aliens heard the music and they came. And now we really have our hands full. We don't know what to do. And this sounds similar, Dr. Farrell, to a theory that you've espoused or that you've supported when you were talking about the harassment of missile silos and things like that, and power disruptions that were attributed to unexplained aerial phenomenon. That would almost imply like, oh no, all right, I went up and tapped an alien on the shoulder, and now he's mucking around in my basement. I don't know what to do.
Exactly. I think there's a lot to be said for that theory, not necessarily from the angle that, SETI has sent signals out there and now they're responding. I think there is something to be said for the argument of Frank Edwards, who was the guy that pointed this out many, many years ago, one of the founders of ufology, that pointed out that the UFO phenomena have been present throughout human history if you examine certain texts in a certain way, but that it definitely seems to have increased. It got a first little bump just prior to World War I, and then during World War I, a number of very strange phenomena are reported over Great Britain during World War I that were attributed to Zeppelins. But when you read these accounts, there's no way that these things were Zeppelins. And then it got a huge bump right before the end of World War II and has continued more or less ever since. And his speculation was that this had to do with humanity acquiring the atomic bomb, and then, of course, later the hydrogen bomb. And a lot of UFO activity around those early hydrogen bomb tests, at least of ours, and probably, by parity of reasoning, the Soviet Union. My suspicion there has always been that if this was, and please note the subjunctive mood here, if this was some sort of response by extraterrestrials to humanity acquiring the bomb, then the real question is why? Why would they be concerned about it? Well, if they're concerned about it, the first problem for ufology is that this knocks the whole argument that ET is much more advanced than we are into a cocked hat, because if they're millions of years ahead of us, a hydrogen bomb isn't going to be of much concern to them. If, however, they are concerned, and the activity around nuclear weapons systems in this country and in the Soviet Union, in France, and so on, certainly seems to indicate that there is some sort of concern, then the question is why. It would seem to indicate that they're not all that much ahead of us, and I suspect that the reason that they might be concerned is that capability is a step in the technology tree to achieving whatever stage they're at. So in other words, my basic argument has always been we're much closer to ET than the ufology crowd wants to admit in terms of our technological capability. So the now what do we do question, I think, is the basic question that I tried to answer, particularly in the second Secret Space Program conference in Bastrop, Texas. I think that was a question that weighed very heavily on the minds of the post-war national security establishment. I think that they were put into exactly the position of asking that question. What do we do now? They're here. They've got advanced capability. What do we do? And I think that the answer was, well, we try to establish a parity or near parity technologically with what we're observing, so as to stave off any potential intervention that might be coming down the pike. I think that was exactly the decision that they took.
Well, so that moves us on to theory number 3, which I'll give you a visual to go with it, Dr. Farrell. This is now, of course, Kaiser Wilhelm is wearing a Hamburg.
Yes.
That's a coincidence, purely a coincidence.
Totally.
Has nothing to do with Nazi collaboration and theory number 3.
No.
But I want to point out that theory number 3 is not collaboration with the aliens. Now, not necessarily by Nazis. In fact, one could say that Kaiser Wilhelm is not a Nazi. There is a Hamburg there, so it's 50-50. But the collaboration theory suggests that either the Nazis or another Western power or some other power have been contacted early and are sort of, or have reached out and achieved contact early and are sort of working alongside the aliens, and sort of they're here, but some nations are not really in the know. Mm-hmm. And that's why we don't have sort of an international unity over solving the alien crisis or whatever. And of course, this is all welded together with the notion that that alien technology is involved, which confuses the issue a little bit. Okay, right. Well, is it aliens or is it Nazis or is it Western powers using the Nazis or is it aliens that really liked the Nazis' technology and thought they had cool uniforms and just adopted that stuff wholesale? Right. You know, what is put on Hamburgs and let's do it, invade Poland? You know, what is the deal with theory number 3?
Let me take a break and I will tell you.
Oh, excellent. Well, while you're breaking.
Transport 3 men safely to and from the moon's surface. These are other types of manned and remote control mechanisms, each designed for a specific function, many already in operation as satellites of this Earth, some in readiness for the moonshot, others designed for space, a few to serve as space stations, and the most complex of all, prototypes of craft capable of putting a man on the surface of another planet. Wheel was one of man's first inventions and has been with him all of his civilized life. But now it, like so many other of his creations, must be modified to fit his new demands. These are 3 types of variable radius wheels, designed to transport a vehicle over a radius. New concepts are being created almost daily. Some will never get beyond the drawing board, but others, or their descendants, will become part of man's greatest adventure, the exploration and colonization of space. All over the world, men and women are working to make that dream a reality. Every aspect of the journey is being analyzed, from the tiniest control devices to the mightiest rocket engines. But it's not enough to just get there. Just as the great explorer sailed from Spain.
That's really the most interesting theory to me so far. Not necessarily Kaiser Bill, but but it's the most interesting theory to me because it's the theory that the idea of some sort of collaboration, or the idea that, you know, the alternative expression of this theory is the crash and retrieval hypothesis, that this country and a number of other countries have had crashes where they have gone out and recovered allegedly extraterrestrial advanced technology and have attempted to back engineer it. This theory is, to me, on the one hand, the most epistemologically viable theory. It makes sense on the surface. And yet, when you examine the way it's been used in the ufology community, I still see Kaiser Bill staring at me. I'd much rather see you than Kaiser Bill. But the problem with that
He's
theory,
stuck. I'm not able to get rid of him now that I launched him. I've tried turning him off several times, but I'm working on it. I guess he's persistent. Once you have a Kaiser, they don't let go of power.
They don't let.
Now he's blocking my whole thing.
Oh, geez. Anyway, the problem with the collaboration theory, as I see it, Daniel, is that it's used as a kind of epistemological deus ex machina type of theory. That whenever you get the allegation that we've achieved a lot of technological advances, that this all has to be attributed to ET. This was kind of the argument of Philip Corso's book, The Day After Roswell. You hear this even used by my friend, colleague Richard Hoagland quite a bit, where, the idea that the Nazis achieved such a technological explosion in the 12 years of the Third Reich, that it could only have come from some sort of extraterrestrial contact or crash and retrieval. This was certainly buttressed by some of the Nazis themselves. Dr. Hermann Obert, after he was brought over to this country, was asked very directly during a press conference by an American reporter, how did you guys manage to achieve so much in such a short time? And his answer was, we had help. And he left it at that. But it should be pointed out that Dr. Obert was also very heavily involved in the occult, just like Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in its very earliest days. So we don't quite know what he was getting at. My problem with the collaboration theory is that if you're going to advance that theory, then you have to argue the evidentiary case very, very carefully. I have not seen to this day any good, solid prima facie case that this is the explanation to be advanced in the case of the Nazis. We certainly have more solid cases with Roswell, with the Cape Girardeau crash in 1941, and some of those events that something happened and they went out and recovered it. But again, people know that I'm not on the ET bandwagon for Roswell. I don't know what to think as of this date about the Cape Girardeau case. But let me give an example of how I think epistemologically, there you go, that this should be argued by drawing the illustration of the bell. People know that I've written a lot of books about the Nazi bell. I've written about 5 or 6 covering that story. And the reason I did that is if you go back and look at the evidence for that story, it all is coming out of the Polish researcher Igor Witkowski, who wrote about the bell in the last chapter of his book, The Secret or The Truth About the Wunderwaffe. And the last chapter of that book, it's a very extensive, long chapter, is devoted solely to that topic. That story was picked up by Nick Cook, who is a writer for Jane's Defense magazine in Great Britain, a very prestigious military hardware intelligence journal, and popularized in the English language in his book, The Hunt for Zero Point. So I had a dilemma when I was covering and beginning to write about that story. How do you verify a story that ultimately is coming out of one source? Well, the key thing there is that Witkowski provides a wealth of very detailed minutia and data about the project. So he's giving you enough information that you can go out and attempt to reconstruct the technology tree, the engineering papers, the physics concepts, the corporate relationships, the personnel involved. So that's what I attempted to do. I attempted to verify his story, not by looking at its sensational aspects, but going detail by detail to see if I could corroborate what he was saying. And I think over the years that I've managed to do a fairly good job. But what that story does not do is indicate any collaboration. And the problem there is with the collaboration story is that that story is used as an explanation so often that what it does, in effect, Daniel, is it heads off anybody going out and doing that. They simply say, okay, it's alien technology, but they don't argue the case. What that collaboration theory does, in my mind, then, is it turns off the switch to go out and try and verify the story through traditional investigative techniques. That's the problem with it. So I think, on the one hand, it's a very strong hypothesis. It makes a lot of sense from a superficial examination. But when you dig into how it's actually being used within the ufology community, what it's actually doing is it's shutting off investigative research.
Well, and just again, pointing to the hat you should vote for. I want to address this because it's related to another theory, which is, and again, people break these out different ways. These are not, I didn't take this from the end-all be-all Wikipedia list of UFO theories, but which I'm sure exists. But so you have the collaboration theory, but then there's a pivot on the collaboration theory, which is, we'll call it theory number 4, and that is the government knows and we're already at war. And that theory is less collaboration than it's the collaboration theory, but turned into its opposition, where we actually have a secret war with the aliens. An example of the kind of how news would get interpreted, if one accepts that theory, is there's a recent story that NASA plans to nuke an asteroid called Bennu.
Right.
And so Bennu is this asteroid that they think there's like a 1 in 2,700th chance that it could hit Earth, but that's seems like a pretty big chance. It's not in the millions or the tens of thousands. It's in the couple of thousands that it might hit Earth, and so they're already sort of mapping out a plan that, yep, we're going to nuke it. I'm not sure I trust us to nuke something and not make it worse. So this
Not me in
just,
that camp.
yeah, exactly. Like, how many asteroids have you nuked out of the way before? So this is your first.
Exactly.
This is kind of like hiring a contractor that comes to you and says, I'm not going to repave your driveway. I'm going to build your whole house. I've never built one before. I've never seen it done. This is my first time, but my sketches are inspiring and would,
Yeah, exactly.
That's disturbing. But the idea that this would get interpreted is that this would get interpreted as, all right, you're not just nuking an asteroid out of the way. Maybe something's slinging asteroids at us. Now, again, they made the point in the Penn and Teller movie that so much of UFO culture seems to be enhanced by what we see in movies, and actually then shapes the UFO culture to be more and more similar to what we see in movies. So you get aliens. The first aliens are these giant, hulking, very big, physically strong, 7.5 foot tall beasts with bug eyes and hairy ape bodies. And as people see that, then the first aliens get described that way. And then another movie comes out and portrays them as little gray men. And pretty soon we're describing them that way more. There's a lot more reports that, no, that's what the aliens really look like. And it goes on from there. So it's probably not by accident that Starship Troopers is not the only novel, by the way, but Orson Scott Card certainly Ender's Game. But the notion is that asteroids are these weapons. And of course, we just had a flyby by a big spear-shaped asteroid. So all of this would get interpreted potentially within this theory as we're at war, there are lots of different weapons being used, and we're given a different story for what this all means, a different narrative to explain it.
Right. Well, Richard Hoagland and I did a show recently where he talked about the long asteroid, the Numa or whatever, I can't pronounce it. It's that Hawaiian name for that very peculiar elongated asteroid that came barreling into the Soviet solar system and then barreled back out. He tends to think that for some interesting reasons that it was actually targeted by a nuke, and his reasoning was that there were infrared pictures of that asteroid where one part of it was glowing in the infrared zone, and he thinks it may have been nuked by the powers that be. So, you know, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The idea that we're at war already is, to me, at least plausible for a variety of reasons. Some of these were pointed out by Colonel Corso in his book Day After Roswell. Some of them have been pointed out by others. First of all, you have the persistent activity of UFOs around nuclear weapons sites, and this is an international phenomenon. It's not confined simply to this country. There have been similar instances in the Soviet Union, in France, and so on and so forth. The activity seems to be concentrated around defense installations, and at times that activity can be interpreted, or could be interpreted, as hostile. Then you have Philip Grimsley, who just recently passed away, that was doing all of the infrared, scope sightings of stuff going on up there, and even he put out a few videos where apparently they're shooting at each other. I don't find those particularly compelling in and of themselves, but then when you compare them to the Space Shuttle video 48, STS-48 video, where apparently you do see a bunch of things moving around in a very pattern-like way. You do see shots apparently coming up from the Earth at one of these things that darts off into space, and so on and so forth. You do see also something else very interesting in that video, and that is that the NASA Earth to space communications goes completely silent as all of this is going on. Many people speculate that they went to a secure channel and were talking during the event. There's a lot of little indicators that something like this may be going on. And then, of course, you had those very strange exchanges between President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev back in the day, where Reagan was saying, if we ever come under attack, to Gorbachev, will you help us? And Gorbachev's response was, well, of course we would, So there are these indicators that this is a subject that world leaders have talked about. There are indicators of UFO activity that can be interpreted as hostile around defense installations. There are indicators from space shuttle videos that something is shooting up there for whatever reason. Maybe it's us testing weapons against our own stuff. I don't know. But that whole theory I find plausible. I find it plausible for yet another reason, too, that I have to mention, and that is that, again, you go back to the ancient texts, to these texts of the wars of the gods, and it was anything but jonquils and daisies. These people were shooting at each other, and particularly in the Babylonian texts, they're shooting some pretty sophisticated stuff at each other. So I don't rule it out for that reason. I've never been in the jonquils and daisies crowd. I don't believe that there are space brothers coming, if they exist at all, that they're necessarily, highly advanced, and that necessarily means they're morally advanced.
Well, I certainly want to be your space brother, and so I've decided to adapt your hat, and it's a little big for me, Dr. Farrell. I'm not sure it fits, but I feel good wearing it. That's the important thing. I feel like we're space brothers.
Yeah. Okay.
So anyway, I hear what you say, and I've always wondered about this. They're coming to save us. It's the exact opposite of the narrative. They're coming to kill us. Right. And really, it's flip of the coin unless we have some basis for empirical knowledge about the character of aliens, if there are aliens.
Right.
And I'm thinking there's another source of knowledge there too. So if you and I went to a planet and we were just a couple of alien brothers, and we sort of zoomed in with our superior technology, and to us they're so, you know, not evolved yet. They're like ants. But we saw chickens is a better example. We saw this planet of chickens, and they're just pecking each other's eyes out, and they're just mean spirited, and they just crap it everywhere. And it's like what chickens are, right? I think you and I would destroy them and blow them out of the water. I don't think we would tolerate this abomination of a world of chickens. And so I'm figuring that, okay, we either need to know something about the aliens, or we need to know something about how we might look to aliens. And then we can figure out what they're going to do to us when we get here. So yes, they're going to meet us in the park, and they're going to play a harp and sing Kumbaya. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I don't either. And it's an important question. How do we view this moral problem? And I'm of the opinion, and I've even been toying with the idea of doing a webinar precisely on this topic of what is the moral epistemology that you need for a sound philosophy of contact. And for me, it comes down to the idea that there is a cosmological moral order. In other words, I don't buy the theory that some people put out that aliens would necessarily have a different morality due to the fact that they are alien, or due to the fact that they are much more advanced. I've never bought that. I don't think scientific and technological achievement necessarily means you act morally with it. I mean, look at humanity. But on the other hand, I don't think that you can safely throw aside the human moral code as a means of evaluating this behavior that we see. Like I say, some of the activity of UFOs around defense sites is clearly hostile, and can be, and I think should be, interpreted in that way. But that means that, to my way of thinking, that if it is to be interpreted as hostile, then why, with all of their advanced technology, don't they come down here and simply wipe us out? Well, the answer is they aren't doing it because we've signaled somehow to them that we are very, very close to where they are in terms of our capability to respond to anything like that. So take it for what you will.
Convinced that we're going to wipe ourselves out, so there's no point.
Well, that could be true too.
Those chickens will not be. They won't last long. They're going to run out of stuff. But I hope that your webinar utilizes puppets, Dr. Farrell, because
please.
I mean, when you explain aliens, you need to be able to say that they're not coming here to save us. They're coming here to judge us and destroy us. What are the biblical plagues? You know, you've got to.
That is a David Icke reptilian puppet right there.
You've got to.
Every time I hear that theory, I think of Kermit the Frog
or Scooter.
Yeah, Scooter.
But yeah, I mean, it's 6 of one, half dozen the other, right? Like when I look at humanity, I'm like, would I come down and go to the park with them? Like, no, we're not that cool to hang out with. And that brings us. We'll deal with that under Theory 7, but that brings us to Theory 5. Okay. So Theory 5 is not planets but dimensions. So. Okay. So the idea is, okay, they're aliens, but they didn't fly here in a ship from the planet, Buzon or something. But so Stephen Hawking's last paper gave us a prescription for how to prove whether or not that we live in a multiverse. And so this is interesting to scientists because, it's different than proving we live in a multiverse, and it's different than having simply, Stephen Hawking said that he became a theoretical astrophysicist so he wouldn't have to prove anything. And it's a lot easier to do your homework, right? He wasn't a very good student, and he really didn't want to do that. So, but now getting a prescription for, all right, if we're in a multiverse, you can use these signs like radioactive decay to figure it out. Right. Then that excites scientists because now they can go on and do more work. So if we live in a multiverse, then potential is that things can travel between the parts of the multiverse.
Mhm.
And that would certainly be one mechanism for explaining why these things aren't just filling our night sky all the time, and they seem to leave pretty quickly. Sure, they go fast, but it's not like they're in Kansas and an hour later they're reported in, Hawaii, and then now other countries are picking them up and they're just circling. Where's their airport? Where do they land? And we're not picking them up in orbit, so and we can pick up pretty small space trash up there. So this multiverse explanation would explain a lot of stuff. The ability to pop in and pop out. It would certainly address a lot of other related theories, from the Philadelphia experiment to the Bermuda Triangle. You get where I'm going. I'll let you just address the theory.
Well, to me, it's plausible. Again, I don't rule out. I've never been philosophically opposed to the idea of ETs. I'm just merely skeptical at all of the so-called proofs. The multi-dimensional multiverse theory is perhaps the most problematical in this way, in that it would be very difficult to determine the difference in terms of that theory of interdimensional beings coming here and a technology that in effect is a completely stealth technology. And the reason I say that is that if you go online, you can look at papers in physics recently where they have taken events and so completely shrouded them from the time stream. They've literally been able to remove micro events from the time stream and then reinsert them later. So that kind of stealth technology would, to my mind, be very difficult to distinguish between that and an actual interdimensional being. Now, that said, I'm not opposed to the idea of interdimensionality because, again, you've got a very long philosophical and theological tradition going all the way back to Egypt, Greece, Christianity, Judaism, and so on, where you have the idea of beings that are not, they're living beings, but they're not organic life forms in the sense that you and I are. They're not physically embodied organic life forms. They are, for want of a better expression, they're plasma life forms. And, the famous physicist David Bohm quit his plasma research because he was dealing with things that began to behave like life as far as he was concerned. So he just quit. So I don't rule it out of the picture. It would be part and parcel, to my mind, of some of the hidden experiments that I think are probably taking place with CERN. They finally admitted that they're looking for extra dimensionality. So again, could they be doing this? Could ET be that sort of creature? Sure. I don't rule it out of the picture.
Well, if we want to look for inorganic life forms, I just think we travel to Washington and we find a few.
Yes, we do.
I just figured, stack up the hats, Dr. Farrell.
Swamp creatures, yes.
But
you're just jealous of my Hamburg. That's what all of this is.
That's what it is. I'm jealous enough to just drop it on my head, and I'm trying very hard to mimic you, Dr. Farrell.
Yeah, and failing
very hard. Well, it's difficult when I don't have a real Hamburg. But
yes.
So, and I'm also convinced this is the superior hat. Look at that big D, nice American D.
Yeah,
a couple of American holes for when you sweat. What's going to happen when Dr. Farrell sweats? It's just going to build up in his hat. There's no vent.
I don't sweat. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know. But yes, inorganic life forms do seem to have taken over Washington. I'm not sure that they live and breathe the way that we do. The next theory is, you could call it a tongue-in-cheek theory, but it's Dr. Farrell, I think we have to give it credence as an actual theory, because so much, it's not that anybody says this, it's that so much of ufology implies this theory, that at some point it's not critical enough thinking unless we therefore add it all up and say, well, the premise that you're articulating equals this theory. So this is theory number 6, advanced but bumbling. So the idea here is that aliens are here, or there are aliens, but they're like Laurel and Hardy. They're not very bright, and they keep mucking it up. And I mean, one thing after another. It's not like they just haven't figured out, space toilets or something. I mean, these guys can't do anything right. They're the Larry, Moe, and Curly of aliens. So give you a couple of examples. Number one, the lights in the night sky thing presumes that aliens would have arrived through interstellar travel, bewildered and unaware that we can see their bright lights. And once aware, they would continue to go about without turning them off, despite crowds shooting pictures and stuff like that. They're like, darn it, forgot to turn off the lights again, Whereas at other times, apparently they're flying around without the lights because you can't see them. So it's just like, oh yeah, I left my lights on again. Where are my car keys? So that's Bumble number 1. Bumble number 2, they would send manned vehicles at all. Why not drones? If we can have drones fly over and take a picture of the girl next door sunbathing, why can't they fly a drone here? Why would you send a manned vehicle? That doesn't seem to be all that smart. The possibility of capture, the long travel. I mean, even if the long travel wasn't there are other reasons. The need for resources and so on. Also, and certainly they would have developed a level of technology capable of gathering data that far exceeded their need to be here in person and would be far less biased. So it's not like you're flying a being that's super bright here. If they're this bright, they wouldn't be leaving their lights on. Bumble number 3. So supposedly they're coming for our resources, but that doesn't make a lot of sense. For one, there's too many uninhabited planets out there. 2, if you've got interstellar travel, you can synthesize nearly any resource you want. They're not coming for our water because it ain't that hard to make H2O with all the hydrogen in the freaking universe. They're not coming for our food because they wouldn't have made it here unless they had a way to manufacture food, manufacture energy, manufacture all the basic resources. They're not coming for our minerals because you can find most of the minerals that would be of any use in the asteroids in more abundance. I mean, there's these big chunks of gold flying around up there, and they're going to come here and dig, employ people to do it. Another one is, why come in person? Not just because you could use a drone, but let's say that you did need to have an intelligent being here for some reason. Drones aren't the only options. We're busy in the US. We're working on mapping the human brain for the purpose of laser porting it to other planets. National Geographic just did an article called "There's Only One Way for Humanity to Survive: Go to Mars," and it's talking about this desire. Now, again, it's a materialist assumption, but it's talking about this idea that hey, we can map the brain and then just use lasers to push it where we want at a speed that is incredible and would allow us interstellar travel faster than light travel. So that's another. Man, these guys are dumb. They're doing it all wrong. They're sending little gray men, and they're flying around in lit up Christmas tree spaceships. And apparently they didn't have enough water when they left. And then finally, and there's others. I could cite other bubbles, but I'll just cite one more. What, they can't encrypt their radio signals? So here they are. They can't hide their reptilian masks. That I get. It's hard. When you look at George Bush Jr. and Sr., as that guy says in the video, I see it too. It's a poor disguise. But I mean, you should be able if the Nazis could encrypt their signals, and it took us a lot to break the Enigma code, these guys should be able to even hide the fact that they're sending a signal. I seriously doubt. I mean, if we're picking it up on my AM radio from the 1970s, going, what is that crackle? Is that aliens? Then they're really bubbling. So nobody goes around to UFO conferences, Dr. Farrell, saying that there's this advanced race of super interstellar travelers who are just plain stupid. They're the Biff and Buffy of aliens. But if you listen to all the little points and add them up, you kind of arrive at that. How can you not have that as a potential theory?
This is one of the biggest problems. This theory right here is one of the biggest problems that I have with ufology. And it goes back to the collaboration, crash, and retrieval theory. And I've said this many times in interviews. that, you know, if we explain everything on the basis of crash and retrieval, reverse engineering, advanced technology, pretty soon we are going to have to start crashing stuff on ET's home world so that they can catch back up with us. In other words, it's a circular argument here that ultimately points out the contradiction. Because if they've got all this advanced technology, how on earth does it end up crashing in New Mexico in the Roswell event, as some people think that it took place during a thunderstorm, it was struck by lightning, and down comes this advanced alien technology? Again, how does it crash in Cape Girardeau, Missouri in 1941? Yeah, you're dealing with bumblers here that is so contradictory at one and the same time, that they're saying that this is advanced technology. ET is so much more advanced than us, and yet he's a bumbler and loses all this technology to these monkeys down here on this planet. To me, this is the biggest epistemological problem in ufology. No one wants to confront that issue. And to me, what it's really pointing out, if I can go back to my problem with ufology and the argument that ET must be technologically and therefore morally superior to us by thousands, if not millions of years, because everything in the record is pointing, if you accept the ET hypothesis to begin with, everything in the record is pointing to the fact that no, whoever they are, if we grant the ET proposition, they are not all that much more advanced than we are. They have accidents. Their technology fails them at certain points. And that should tell us that if that's the case, then they are not hundreds of years or thousands of years ahead of us. They may only be decades ahead of us. Back to my argument about, well, why would they be concerned about A-bombs and hydrogen bombs if they're that far ahead of us? And the answer is, that's a false assumption. You have to look at the other assumptions. So this is a big contradiction. I don't see anybody, certainly not me, certainly not any of the other researchers I'm aware of in ufology, that have adequately addressed this problem. And until they do, it makes they're only ignoring a crucial argument that underpins, or pardon me, cuts the rug out from underneath everything else that they're saying, which makes a mockery of what they're trying to say. They've got to address this issue. I don't think anyone has. The real problem then becomes, if they are bunglers, then are these acts around defense installations really hostile acts, or is it ET bumbling, once again, doing all this stuff? We don't know. But we have to address the issue.
Well, the potential for stupid ET is certainly part of the literature, and we've okie dokie in the morning munchin. We've got
Yep.
stupid ETs in our culture, and if we're studying popular culture to derive our notions of ET, there's our precedent. But
there it is.
Yes, Jar Jar Binks, the big mistake of the one of the many big mistakes. Well, actually, I think all the later movies are the big mistakes. I just like the first three.
Yeah, I didn't have a problem with the first three, but episode 7 was just a dog.
The teenage love between, so why did they have to turn it into the Twilight in space, saga? Does he like me? I'm not sure if he likes me.
I had a lot more use for the Rogue One episode than I did for the actual 7th episode. That was just a dog.
But Anakin, he's just a bad boy. He turns up his collar. He's got a motorcycle, the equivalent, space equivalent. He's the James Dean of his generation. And I get it. I get why it would be attractive. But all right. So theory number 7. Theory number 7 is in many ways is a rejection that aliens are really there, or that it's relevant if they're there. It doesn't actually deal with the question itself of do aliens exist. It deals with what is the explanation for most of the alien phenomenon,
Right.
or most of the phenomenon that we see that gets attributed to this issue.
Right.
So theory number 7 is our own narcissism and potentially hubris. So again, doesn't mean there's no aliens, but it may mean that most of what we chalk up as, oh, look at that, may actually have nothing to do with the question of whether there are aliens.
Right.
So first off, here's a bit of narcissism. There's some points under this. Number 1, why would they be interested in us in the first place? Are we really the most attractive planet of chickens in the universe that they would come here? This is actually reinforced by a theory that closely parallels the Fermi paradox. So the theory is called the Great Filter. And the Great Filter essentially says, to quote one write-up, the Great Filter hypothesis posits that before intelligent life has the opportunity to escape the bounds of its original planet, it hits some sort of wall, which we call the Great Filter. So there are certain transitional moments from an evolutionary perspective that any planet like ours would have to master before communicating with other worlds. Some happen in the early stages of life, and in our case, we may be running up against that filter at this point of our evolution. So in other words, for example, we would need we might need interstellar travel. We would need the ability to, but also certain cultural things. We need the ability to come together as a planet and act as a planet versus sort of being at each other's throats, even within individual nations, let alone between individual nations. One could argue there's no sign that we have actually neared any ability to interact with or be a useful interface with aliens at all as a species, that we haven't culturally advanced, one could argue, that much. I mean, sure, you got an iPhone, but culturally, one could argue one has not advanced much since the ancient Babylonians. So if you look at the Great Filter, that's one of them. Why would they be interested? Plus, if you were to be them and you were to look at us, would you find us candidates in the first place, even from a practical standpoint, whether or not we were interesting? Maybe you're like the Federation of Planets. You go around and just pick up anybody that's ready. But if you decide they're not only not ready, but they're basically on a path of destruction, that would be a reason not to establish contact. Also, I mean, we've talked about the fact that people with interstellar travel wouldn't need our energy of our water and stuff. They could make their own. They're not here to watch Netflix. So if one is going to invest the resources, and regardless of whether they're past the monetary system, if you want to listen to New Agers and so on, there's still just a logical use of resources. If one is going to invest the resources to come to Earth and focus on the Earthlings, there needs to be a positive reason. There needs to be something besides something we can take from you, which they don't need, or something that doesn't seem to be clearly available to our character. So what is that positive reason? I've yet to hear a very satisfactory answer. Others will say, well, of course, I've got a reason. They're here to enslave us. But why would they need to do that? They've got robots. And again, this makes us think that this is narcissism. In a way, it makes us think that we're very important. It's very much like the abductees, or the guy that says, I would tell you, but then they would kill me and I can't do it, who are so central to our own narrative, so self-important, so sure of our significance, that of course the aliens would be interested in me. It's like somebody going through high school and just sure that every other person of the opposite sex in that high school is looking at me and is interested in what I'm doing. There's actually a syndrome for that. There's a lot of people that grow up insecure from high school who still think that everybody's looking at them and is judging them and so on. And that belief that you're being monitored all the time is really linked to a couple of things, but one of them is narcissism. So, and besides, I mean, Dr. Farrell, even if they wanted to enslave us, you take one look at, the American workforce has really declined. If you visited a Barnes and Noble lately, you take one look and you're like, all right, I can barely get that guy to not call in sick every other week. I don't think, I don't think he can't get back from lunch on time. I don't think I'm going to enslave him. He's just not a useful candidate for interstellar slavery if there are other beings to choose from in the world. And then finally, there's sort of like our planet itself. I mean, why would I don't think they want to live here. It'd be like moving to Reno. And unless you're in Reno and love Reno, nobody wants to move to Reno. You know, I don't care where you are. You don't sit in the worst swamp in South Carolina and go, Reno. I think that would be better.
Mhm.
You just kind of go, it's got its own problems too. I think I'll stick, like in blackjack. So what do you think of this theory that it's irrelevant whether there are aliens here? We probably don't have the equipment to think about the problem because we're too wrapped up in our own narcissism and to a certain degree hubris in trying to attach meaning to the problem at all.
Let me take another break. That's an excellent question. I'm sorry for so many breaks. I've been drinking
Not
tea.
at all. Gives me a chance to play science fiction music.
Drinking tea all day, but that's an important question. I want to talk about that. All right, I'll be right back.
All right.
Discover the Americas so that the colonizers might come later. So will our exploration spacecraft precede the colonizers of the planets. Already plans are being made for the colonies. Sources of food and power must be found. Artificial atmosphere is created. Everything done to build an Earth away from the Earth. No man living today can predict exactly what the future holds. But this much we do know. All through man's march across this earth, the wildest dreams and fantasies of one age have become the commonplaces of the next. The motion picture you are about to see can be called today a fantasy of the future. But one day, maybe not too far distant, audiences will be able to look back on it in the same spirit with which we view pictures about the first covered wagons crossing the plains.
If you're dealing with the question of narcissism, why indeed are they here? But it's interesting to me that this question occurs in ufology, and it occurred centuries ago, millennia ago, in religion, with the cosmic war of the gods, the war between Michael and Lucifer. In the Islamic tradition and in some Christian traditions, there's the idea that the devil revolted against God over the creation of man. And basically, and this is very clear in the Islamic tradition, where you have the idea that man is created this composite hybrid creature that's part spirit, in other words, part interdimensional, and part body. It's both. And in the ancient cosmology, what I find very interesting is you get this, and it's carried over, from Egypt and Mesopotamia on into the Greek philosophers, even as far as Aristotle, Nemesius, and so on, that you get this idea of mankind being the microcosm. In other words, mankind is a reflection of the cosmological order of the universe, and vice versa. You get this idea that the universe is a large man, or a makanthropos, as the Greeks would say, a great man. So in other words, man is kind of the glue, so to speak, that holds everything together. And it's interesting, you look at those ancient empires, the Persians, the Chinese, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, they have this idea that their political order is rooted and reflective of the cosmological order. So in other words, the empire only exists if it's in good order and in harmony with the universe. And again, this is all part of this reflection of microcosm, macrocosm type of doctrines that so many ancient cultures had. So if there's if there's any recurrence of this idea in modern ufology, my suspicion would be that the answer lies not in resources or any of these things itself, but rather that we were given a huge clue in those ancient religions that were saying that it's mankind itself that is the center of the focus here. And that for whatever reason, we're not even aware of our own importance to a certain extent in the cosmological scheme of things. So that would be my answer. There's a spiritual component, in other words, that's not being looked at, that was once there as part of our cultural heritage, that somehow has been filtered out of the contemporary ufology culture.
Well, I wonder if was it Boethius or St. Augustine or a later writer, was it Anselm, who suggested that the earthly order is a mirror of the heavenly, that a microcosm occurs not in some things. It was always Orthodox doctrine that certain things, what happens in the temple happens in the temple,
Right.
in heaven. But this theory was a Western theory that everything that happens on earth is a mirror, is a microcosm of the divine or heaven or a cosmic.
Yeah, it's a persistent theory, east and west. You find it, as I said, you find it in Aristotle, you find it in Nemesius. It's certainly present in Boethius, certainly present in Augustine's City of God. So it's present in Maximus the Confessor, it's present in Plato, it's present in the Hermetica, and it's present in Egyptian religion. So, it's a very, very old doctrine. And one of the things that I think is interesting about it is that when it comes to a consideration of mankind's place in the cosmological order, that man, particularly for the Egyptians, stands right in the center of that order. And you even find that doctrine being reflected in a very curious way in some modern physics doctrines concerning the anthropic cosmological principle, where you have physicists noting this very same thing, that in terms of scale, if you look at the scale from quantum mechanics up to galactic clusters, again, humanity is right smack dab in the center in terms of scale. So it's, this question keeps recurring one way or the other. And what fascinates me about the way you've put it is that it is not yet occurring to ufology, other than people coming out and, as you pointed out, well, if ET's here, what's the relevance? There's no relevance to the question. Well, to ask the question that way, what I'm suggesting is they're not asking the question in the right manner. They have to go back and recover some of these ancient ways of looking at things that might inform that question.
Until you have a fully elaborated sociology of ufology, right, psychology of ufology,
right,
not only from critics on the outside, but developed in part with the people that are interested in this,
right,
then in some sense, it is fair for the rest of us who are not necessarily ufologist converts to, one, either think that in some sense they're not that serious. They don't really,
right.
This is a game. It's sort of like a what if game,
right,
a hypothetical. But if they really thought it was real, they would act like it was real. They would develop an entire science of this, not merely this sort of pop science.
Exactly.
Or so it'd be fair for us to say, well, you don't take it seriously, therefore why should I? It would also be fair to say that if that's beyond you, then this is specifically a phenomenon for simplistic people. And therefore, those of us who don't think of ourselves that way, and in every other field of life, would delve into the anthropology of a thing, or the implications ethically. Then if you're not going to do that, then this just isn't a sophisticated enough group of people to interact with and their theories, until someone with a more sophisticated version of it comes along, who is capable of this level of thought. The third thing we might think is that if there would only be three reasons not to go down this route, this path. Either one, to develop a sophisticated science of this, if you really took it seriously. Number one, you don't really believe it. Number two, you're too simplistic. Or number three, you have a vested interest. It's kind of a scam. You have a vested interest in not doing that,
Precisely.
but in keeping it in this nebulous, loosey-goosey form of thought
Precisely.
that sells a lot of books and videos, versus, the much more difficult thing of, if this was geology, you might have your annual conference and there would be no big revelations, and your keynote speaker would have a fairly boring presentation about, the color of some crystal they found in the middle of some rock, and that was your highlight this year, because it's a slow, tedious process to do science.
I think this question, more than all the others, is addressing the epistemological foundations of ufology and showing up its shortcomings. Because if you flip the question the way I did and go back and look at these ancient doctrines where they're asking essentially the same question, well, why this big war? Why this archangelic or war of the gods or whatever you wish to call it, hoopla? And the answer always seems to come down at some point, regardless of which text you're looking at, the Babylonian, the biblical, what have you. It always seems to come back to the point that somehow mankind itself is front and center. I said in an interview with Georgianne Hughes years and years ago that when she asked this precise question that you're asking, well, why would they be interested in us? And my response was, it is precisely that they are interested in us, not the resources, not the planet, not the hydrogen bombs, but in us. That is the key, because this is what the texts seem to indicate. You find this in the Babylonian text, you find it in the biblical text, you find it in Islamic tradition, in Jewish tradition. You even find it in certain forms in the Vedic tradition. It's mankind itself, for some reason, that is front and center on this cosmic drama. And I think until ufology, like you point out, until ufology addresses that question seriously, which they have not done, other than, as you point out with this theory, simply to dismiss the whole thing as kind of a farce. Until they do it, the subject is going to go nowhere. It's not going to be taken seriously.
And that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that, automatically I'm just going to go, and make fun of somebody.
Right.
But I'm saying, if you don't take what you're saying to me seriously enough to do the intellectual work that I can find in other similar systems of thought, then I am not required by any rule of fairness to take it seriously myself. So I would just point out, we use this meme of a surrogate for religion. So if ufology were a religion, we could compare this to the centuries of intellectual work. And I don't mean, even if you just look at the first century of, say, sort of the three major so-called Western religions. I realize that's a bunch of fraught terminology, but if you take the first century of Christianity, you have a deep cosmological and aesthetic exploration going on. Very deep thinkers looking very meticulously and carefully and really attempting to do some thought. Even reading Boethius right away, you just sort of, you get that people are trying to work this out and have been for a lot of time. What are the implications if we take this seriously? Boethius, for whatever may be his flaws, he was the first Christian thinker I really encountered in the form of ancient texts. But sort of started me down the path. But Boethius, you never once get the impression that he doesn't actually believe what he's saying or take what he's saying seriously enough to handle it with sophistication. He's giving it the full attention of his intellectual prowess. And therefore he attracts others. So that's Christianity, cosmological and aesthetic. One could argue Islam. If you are an image breaker or an iconoclast religion like Islam, and yet you are convinced of the elaborate an elaborate structure in the universe. You do what Islam did. You engage in really deep mathematical and scientific exploration, and
Yes.
you write
Yes.
some of the most seminal texts that were
Yes.
rediscovered in the Crusades and started the Second Aristotelian Revolution
Right.
and so on. You don't sit around and write a book in 6 days that you sell self-published on Amazon. Not that I'm knocking that, but I'm saying if that's the height, if that's all you've got, I don't have to take it. Islam, I can take a lot more seriously. And then Judaism. One could argue that the development of literary inquiry in Judaism is incredibly sophisticated.
Yes.
In terms of the ability to think in a sophisticated way about various texts. What we get out of ufology is, frankly, the most compelling reason why aliens would be interested in us at all is sexual companions.
Yes. Yeah,
You get,
exactly.
they beamed down and probed me and then they slept with me and they made alien babies, and it was a weird marriage ceremony because we are unwilling to think more deeply than that.
Yeah, exactly. And as you know, you're absolutely right. Until they address these puerile elements and begin to raise the questions about the implications of what they're saying. Well, it's a simple question from I had sex with an alien to why did the alien want to have sex with me? And this is the question no one's asking. And again, when you start asking that question, the few people that do are putting out all sorts of more nonsense. Well, they're trying to create hybrids, blah, blah, blah. But that's just pushing the question back. It's not really addressing the question in any formal sense. And this is why I've tried to approach things whole, from examining the ufology question from the standpoint of ancient texts, because they're trying to answer those questions back then. Why are the gods so obsessed with mankind? Why are they bothering at all? And they're thinking about these things at a much more sophisticated and profound level centuries ago than anything I see coming out of ufology. Absolutely.
Well, and it's this notion that behind everything just using that example of sexuality being behind it, the notion that the first thing aliens want to do is sleep with us when they get here. It's a very American sort of preoccupation with things.
Yep.
It's part of that narcissism.
Yep.
That it's almost a masturbatory narrative. And then
it's infantile.
Yeah, and a juvenile or adolescent would be a good explanation, and it reflects a certain socioeconomic class as well, that views a certain kind of TV and obsesses about a certain type of media, and so on. It isn't. There's a whole different cultural set of premises available to people that have gone a little bit deeper. So I think what we're not saying, and that's what I wanted to make clear in this video, is that we're not intentionally belittling or making fun of people. We're not saying, we can joke, and the Penn and Teller video is hilarious,
right.
But you should really zoom in on the part with the probe, which is the part Dr. Farrell found the most interesting. The actual probe used that works in every orifice for this alien exploration. Alien science is very simple, but the one size fits all, except when it doesn't. Some need an extra large, but they're not using kitchen implements. But no. But the battery thing freaked me out because it seems like they would have solar power, Dr. Farrell. That's where I saw through it. But if you flew by the sun, you would figure this out.
Well, it's precisely that infantile adolescent aspect of all of this, the unwillingness to think even about the implications of what they are saying, much less any of the things that we've been talking about. It's the adolescent culture of it all that absolutely, I personally just don't like being around it. I've turned down, just in the last year, 3 different invitations to speak at those UFO conferences, most of them in Nuttyfornia. I just don't like going there because I know exactly what those conferences are going to be like. And, I've got better things to do with my time, quite frankly.
So you heard it here, folks. You need to send Dr. Farrell your brochures and pamphlets that you pick up at those UFO
No,
conferences.
please don't.
He longs to have a file of that
No, I
literature.
do not long to have a file. Thank you very much.
Especially any photos of models of
No,
probes that are
no,
used for medical inspection.
No.
And any interviews. But no, that's it. So we're not trying to make fun of people just to make fun of them. It's not malevolence, or we're not being malicious. It is that if you're going to give us, Dr. Farrell does not ignore things that are sufficiently sophisticated that the person has done their own thinking before asking him to consider them. Would be my presentation of you, Dr. Farrell. It's right. If someone says, Dr. Farrell, will you consider this idea? Your first question is, have you considered it well it's enough and thought through the implications enough that I don't have to do all your work for you? If the answer is no, if it's some Mickey Mouse theory that you haven't spent 2 seconds thinking through, it's even over a cup of coffee, it's not that interesting. So that brings us to our last theory, theory number 8. And theory number 8 is a theory we'll just call other theories. Okay. And so there's a great article at Business Insider, of all places, and we'll post the link with the show notes. I can't possibly go through all the theories offered in this article, but I picked out 4 or so that I thought we didn't already quite cover. So one of those is they missed our window. So alien life has been here. They came, they explored. We weren't born yet. The human race hadn't evolved. And so they've already looked here and moved on, and that's it. They missed us. The time didn't line up. Another theory, and I'm just going to run through these and then let you try. Another theory is the galaxy is full of aliens. It's been colonized, but we're in the boonies. We're just an advanced breed of monkeys on a minor planet of a very average star, to quote Stephen Hawking in Der Spiegel. And so the reason we're not aware of what's happening with all the aliens out there is, frankly, we're in Rio Linda, California, the equivalent of that. And no one tells us unless we get on the radio and listen to Rush this week, I guess. And then for those of you in Rio Linda, he's always got a moment, just a spot for those guys, to kind of catch them up on basic stuff like, water's good for you. And then
yes, dihydrogen oxide is good for you.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, you watched that episode. That was fun.
Yes, I did.
that show, Penn and Teller Bullshit, is pretty good. So that's theory number 2. So number 1, they missed our window. We weren't ready yet. Put us back in the easy bake oven. Number 2, galaxy is colonized, but we're in the boonies. Number 3, I love this one. This is my favorite theory of all time, the best one I've heard. The aliens exist. They're out there, but they're lost in a VR utopia. They have committed they're like gamers. They're in some pod committed to virtual reality. They're in their virtual utopia. They're not going to fly here. Are you kidding? They barely wake up to order pizza. They just keep the Hot Pockets coming and their thumbs twitching on the game controllers. They're done. They're living in VR world. And they certainly can't be bothered with us. Why would they? So just right. What's funny is you go poke your average gamer and there you go. That could be what an alien's like. And then I love that one. There's theory number, why wouldn't, if they're like us, why wouldn't they be like us that way too? There's some of us, if we discovered an alien probe that just took a couple of AA batteries, we wouldn't leave the house either. It's like, I'm ordering in today. Seamless.
You're going to get me started again. I've seen this before.
That's very familiar to me.
It's very familiar.
Folks, you're gonna have to watch the video after.
Yeah, you're gonna have to watch the video.
There are some things we can't say on the air.
No, we can't.
So and the final theory, again, I picked out like 4, is aliens are just nothing like us, meaning there's no bodies. They don't have even minds like us. They don't talk the way we talk. That we can neither hear them nor see them, nor even can our minds conceive of them. There is literally no way to interact. And some people would say, well, then what's the point? And I would say, yeah, but this is an interesting conundrum. And the reason I'm interested in this theory, philosophically, Dr. Farrell, is for two reasons. One, this sounds the most like what might be described as angels, as anything else. And I'm kind of interested in the theory that all creatures exist in some sort of created state, whether you call it a multiverse or a universe or a cosmos. And so if you can conceive of something like angels, it's like conceiving of a tree or a frog. It's a thing, right? And so once you start looking at it like that, why would we assume, since we have all these narratives and metaphors available to us, why would we assume that aliens are anything like us? I mean, maybe they just float around and they look like crystals. You know, those who saw Men in Black, and there was an alien who was just like a rock. That was him, but he was intelligent. The other reason I'm interested in it philosophically is, you know, the original Christian doctrine is that God is unknowable. God is beyond knowledge. He's beyond being beyond knowledge. He's beyond that, because the moment you say beyond knowledge, now you know something, you're describing something. He's beyond even the ability to state that he is beyond. And fundamentally unable to connect with man because of the limitations of man. Fundamentally, there is an uncrossable gulf and barrier between man and God. And hence, the thing that changes that is the incarnation, that God becomes man, so that man might become God, so that man and God may be joined together. That doctrine is that, therefore, there is a solution to this dilemma, which had to be pursued. Well, one finds it fascinating that the notion that what makes us assume that if there are aliens, that they're in any conceivable way compatible with us, corporeally, intellectually, energetically, orally, however you want to. And I mean that for the people that say, well, we can see their auras, in any way, why would they be conceivable to man?
Well, let me go seriatim through these. The last one's the most interesting to me as well. The missed window, we had in the last vid chat, one of our members down under ET posited a really interesting question about dinosaurs and evolutionary theory and so on and so forth. And basically, his philosophical problem with it was, we really don't have a good evolutionary explanation as to why these creatures would evolve and then all of a sudden be wiped out. The theory ultimately doesn't explain anything. And the other problem that he pointed out, and it was a biggie, is the growing amount of textual evidence. He pointed out that you could interpret certain texts as implying the existence of dinosaurs or their near descendants coterminous and at the same time frame as man. And the missed window idea, to me, implies some sort of belief in that theory to begin with, which I have my problems with. The other problem with it, again, is that that's a theory that's not looking at ancient texts as being related to this question. I think they are related, so I would tend to discount that theory. The galaxy is colonized already, and we're living in the galactic equivalent of Rio Linda, California. That one I could believe from just a kind of stellar geography point of view. But again, those ancient texts and doctrines are telling me that something very different is going on, that even though we might be living on some sort of galactic Rio Linda, we're nonetheless, as human beings, we're nonetheless still epistemologically and ontologically at the center of things. Lost in a virtual reality. If they are like us, I could see that happening. I could see it.
Or they could be IV drug users too tuned out to really,
meth heads. Yeah, who knows? And they might be so stoned and high, that's why they're crashing their saucers all over the place.
It's also why they only abduct people from that part of California. Hey, bro, I was
No.
picked up by an
Yeah,
alien.
you know.
dude. You know, he offered me some reefer and then probed me anally.
Jeez. Well, yeah, that could be an explanation too. They might be driving drunk through the galaxy. Who knows?
That explains the accidents and
That
stuff like
explains
that.
the accidents.
They're just a bunch of molesters and sex fiends, high and loose with a driver's license.
It works. But there's a serious point to be made here. Is I go back to what I said before. I think that if you accept certain types of cosmology, be you religious or not, there's widespread agreement that there's a moral order to the cosmos. And if that's the case, then we would have to assume that ET, if any exists, are capable of bad behavior, and capable of getting lost in virtual realities. I don't discount that. The most interesting thing here is the idea that they are so radically different from us. And we hear this all the time in ufology, that, they're so radically different that we don't know if they're acting morally or not. What might be moral to us might not be moral to them, and so on and so forth. Again, that's not an argument I buy, because what that does epistemologically is it splits the cosmos into two different moral orders. And I just don't think the cosmos works that way. If they're going to develop science, that has to be built on some sort of understanding of a moral order. It's the old rule of law idea. You can't have a society where there's no rule of law. That's why societies begin to break down, is when they start to ignore that and to attempt to emplace in society things that are a different type of moral order. I can see, to a certain extent, the idea of alien intelligence being foreign to us. And for me, one of the hugest clues there that might be possible is the octopus. The octopus is one of my favorite animals. Well, these are incredibly smart creatures. They learn from each other, and it appears now that they've taken the next evolutionary step, because octopuses tend to be solitary creatures, but now in off the coast of Spain, they're beginning to live and learn and work together in these little communities, which is never been observed before with these creatures. They're very smart. They learn from each other. They figure things out, and yet they're so foreign to us. Their brain structures almost completely different. And if you look at the development of cephalopods on the evolutionary tree, it's like you've got that branch of things, and then you've got the branch of phyla that lead ultimately to humans. So there's a huge division there, but nonetheless they're intelligent creatures. So I think you can look at that in a certain sense and say, yeah, that's possible. But even there, I think you're going to come square against the question of moral order to the cosmos. If there is no moral order to the cosmos, then ultimately everything begins to break down. Science begins to break down because you've got no foundation on which to build it. It's all accidental. One thing's as good as another. And obviously things can't work that way. So, I'm pointing out the octopus simply because, like I said, some of them appear now to be taking the next step in the evolutionary chain and developing kind of primitive little communities where they're actually living and learning together. So, and it's a phenomenally smart creature because, they only live 2 or 3 years. So by doing this, they're kind of shortening the learning span. So is that possible? Yeah, I think it's possible.
Well, Dr. Farrell, I want to, if you're at a UFO conference and you have questions for Dr. Farrell, there's a strong chance he may look at you like this. Whoever's getting that glare of, did you really just ask me about that? That's what you can expect. So be careful what you pop off with.
Well, That picture was taken. I've told that story. That picture was taken at Laughlin, Nevada. And the reason somebody was asking me a question over here to my side, that's the reason I was looking in that direction. But during the actual presentation itself, I had to look to both sides because sitting directly in front of me, about 10 rows back, was this lady with Lucille Ball red hair that was kind of in a Phyllis Diller tangle of hair. And she had a green beret in her hair. And on the end of the beret, there were these two springs that were coming out of the beret with these little alien eyes bobbing around like this. So I couldn't look straight ahead because every time I did, I'd see that and start laughing. So, so I had to do my whole presentation looking this way and looking that way, but never looking that way.
Well, Dr. Farrell, don't you know that when you attend these things, you're supposed to dress the part. You're supposed to get ready and actually show up with your antenna and your ADD UFO spinner, that you can spin around. You're supposed to have all the gear.
I didn't have all the gear.
Anal probe, all the stuff with you that you
Stop
need.
with the anal probes, for crying out loud.
Hey, I didn't bring them to this planet, and I certainly didn't use them on the lady that you saw in the Penn and Teller video. I had nothing to do with that.
Well, yeah, I've seen these.
Neither did Penn and Teller. It was not part of the video, on or off camera.
Oh, that made my day. I laughed for 10 solid minutes about that.
Yeah, when you came to the show, you started over again. It was great. Well,
Oh, dear.
It's been an interesting show, Dr.
Yes,
Farrell.
thank you.
We've probed this issue.
Yes, and vote for the right hat, folks.
That's right. Yes, vote for the right hat. Remember that one of these hats is from this planet, and the other
Belongs to
clearly
Kaiser Wilhelm.
is from an aristocratic reptilian bloodline that I figure that hat is designed to receive signals from someplace that isn't,
Yes,
us.
World War I was the responsibility of the lizards.
That's right. That's right. So just keep it in mind. Well, Dr. Farrell, thank you. We'll get this up in the member section.
Okay, thank you, sir.